for Congressional and Federal Relations at the American Psychological Association. Before we begin, I wanted to cover a few logistics. This briefing is being recorded, and we will share the recording along with any corresponding documents afterwards. In addition to our featured speakers, we will also be hearing from two members of Congress, Congresswoman Johanna Hayes and Senator Alex Padilla. We will also have time at the end for a Q&A. So if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A box at any time during the briefing, and we will try to get to as many as we can at the end. So with that, I'll turn it over to 2022 APA President and a member of the APA Task Force on Violence Against Educators and School Personnel, Dr. Frank Worrell.
Thank you, Kenneth. As Kenneth indicated, my name is Frank C. Worrell. I'm the 2022 President of the American Psychological Association and a member of the APA Task Force on Violence Against Educators and School Personnel. In 2013, in an article in American Psychologist, several members of a previous iteration of this task force, including 4 who are with us today, outlined a research and policy agenda for understanding and preventing violence directed against teachers. And now, a decade later, the task force is once again reporting current data on violence directed against educators and school personnel, data collected in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. We will also be providing some recommendations for policy. We are joined today in this briefing by several partners, including the American Federation of Teachers, the National Education Association, the National Association of School Psychologists, the National Association of School Social Workers, and the School Social Work Association of America. However, before we continue our program, we'll be hearing from 2 members of Congress, right? Our first presentation will be from Senator Alex Padilla. Senator Padilla is the first Latino to represent California in the US Senate. He was appointed in January 2021 to complete the Senate term of Vice President Kamala Harris. In his short time in the Senate, Senator Padilla has proven himself to be a champion of education and mental health. He deeply values the work educators do on a daily basis, and as a strong supporter of the Individual with Disabilities Education Act and school-based mental health services, he understands the importance of equitable access to high-quality education in setting children up for a lifetime of prosperity and success. Senator Padilla has introduced key legislation, such as the Comprehensive Mental Health in Schools Pilot Program Act, which we believe would be tremendously helpful in addressing many of the findings we will be discussing here today, as well as legislation to officially recognize a National School Psychology Week. Although Senator Padilla cannot be with us in person, he did send this personal message. We thank him and his staff for all that they do. And now we will hear from Senator Padilla.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me to join you for this important briefing. As a proud graduate of Los Angeles Public Schools and a longtime advocate for equity in education, I'm thankful for your hard work and dedication to all of our students. It was almost exactly 2 years ago that our schools suddenly switched to distance learning to stop the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. Teachers and administrators stepped up overnight to learn new technologies, plan new lessons, and give students the stability of the classroom during a time of fear and uncertainty. As parents to 3 growing boys, my wife Angela and I will always remember the heroic work their teachers put in to help them continue to learn. But today, even as classrooms are able to lift pandemic restrictions, many students and teachers are still struggling. The proportion of kids visiting an emergency room for a mental health crisis has risen by more than 24% during the pandemic. Just about everyone has experienced serious struggle from uncertainty, isolation, and grief, especially in underserved communities where the pandemic hit hardest. It's no surprise that almost half of teachers have thought about leaving or changing their jobs. We need to work together to retain and support dedicated teachers because a strong public school system is the foundation of the American dream. I introduced the Comprehensive Mental Health in Schools Pilot Program Act to build up effective services within our school communities. The COVID-19 pandemic has underscored the need for school mental health systems that can provide all of the support and services that students desperately need. That includes funding to support services and professional development for teachers who need more tools to address the challenges that they face in the classroom. I want to thank the APA's Task Force on Violence Against Educators and School Personnel for researching the dangers that school staff face and advocating for innovative solutions. We have a long path ahead to help school communities recover from the stress, disruption, and learning loss of the pandemic. Supporting teachers and administrators is a critical part of that task, and this briefing will help us to take the next steps forward. We must keep fighting to meet the needs of all students. I look forward to continuing that work together.
So we thank Senator Padilla and his staff for the work that they're doing in this area. We're also hoping to be joined by Congresswoman Hayes, who's been delayed. And so I will now turn the floor over to—
The Congresswoman is here, Frank, so we will—
Okay.
There she is.
Thank you. Okay, I didn't see it. Congresswoman, welcome. Let me introduce you. Congresswoman Hayes represents Connecticut's 5th Congressional District. She is the first African-American woman ever elected to Congress from the state of Connecticut. Having spent 15 years as a teacher, including being named the 2016 National Teacher of the Year, Congresswoman Hayes has a unique perspective on the work that educators do and the type of stresses they face. A hallmark of her time in Congress has been her leadership on education policy, including by introducing key legislation such as the Save Education Jobs Act, which would help retain educators and other critical school personnel in the workforce. A champion for teachers and students alike, we are lucky to have a voice in Congress and are thrilled that she could join us today. Welcome, Congresswoman Hayes. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for engaging in this incredibly important work. You're right, my legislation that I introduced is to save education jobs, because having worked 15 years in the classroom at an urban public school, I recognize all too well that whenever school districts are faced with budget constraints or challenges, the first people to go, or the first line items in the budget that are eliminated, are all of those support services jobs. You know, our guidance counselors, our behavior tech professionals, our mental health professionals, our school nurses, our, music and art teachers, all of the people who help support the foundation that students need to learn. Those are the first jobs to go. At the very beginning of this pandemic, I recognized that we were faced with unprecedented challenges. And I was thinking ahead to the fact that when our students returned, the people to receive them had to be thoroughly prepared and properly resourced. So that's why I introduced the Save Education Jobs Act, to create an education stabilization fund to support the professionals, to engage professionals that would be there on the ground when students return. This is something that is more important during a pandemic, but there has always been a need for it. For so many of our children, they receive all of their support services at school, whether it be speech therapy, occupational therapy, and most of the time schools are the first place where developmental milestones are detected. When students are behind, when they're not making their progress, and it's not always in academic areas. So having that huge gap of students not being in the classroom and having to navigate all of these experiences on their own put me on notice that we have to do more. As an educator in Congress and sitting on the Committee of Education and Labor, where we make federal education policy, where Congress is deciding how to make academic and education expenditures, I feel like my voice is a unique perspective that needs to be heard on so many of these issues. As we've seen in the last 2 years, the Congress has made unprecedented investments in education, more than we've done in the last 100 years. But for so many of our school districts, all that did was put them back at zero because they had been behind for so long. They had been under-resourced, underfunded, with physical environments that were lacking and deteriorating. And we have a responsibility to do better. So I am so grateful for this report, for taking a deep dive into the root causes of why people are leaving the profession, of looking at how violence against educators is a problem that persists in every community. At the beginning of my career, it was not part of my experience or my academic training to do, school shooter drills. By the time I left the classroom, we were doing them once a month. By the time I left the classroom, there were so many other factors that I had to deal with. And now, as I look back at what is happening around the country, teachers are faced with so many new challenges that I could not have even imagined, whether it is the rhetoric at board meetings or what is happening right in their school buildings, as they are trying to engage in active teaching. That should not be something that our educators and administrators have to deal with. So we have to really look at the root causes of it and work to make sure that schools are safe places for everyone. So I am grateful for this report and everything that is outlined in it. And I can tell you that from my perspective as a member of Congress, I will continue to bring the voices of educators into this conversation and remind people of why it is important, why it is important that teachers and educators feel safe and supported, because they are breathing life into our next generation of young people. And they cannot do that if their own safety is at risk or their family safety is at risk. My biggest fear is, apart from people leaving the profession, is that young people like me, hopeful, optimistic people who always wanted to be a teacher, will make the decision not to even enter the profession because they feel that the stress is too much for them to handle, and they'll choose to do something else. And our children will miss out on just, the richness of what those people would have brought to our schools and to our communities. So again, thank you for the work that you do in this area. I am appreciative of being a partner in this work and excited that there are thought leaders around the country in all of these prospective areas that are saying, this is what we can add to the conversation because it is so important and we have to get it right this time.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Hayes. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks for your work in this area in Congress and before you joined Congress. We are very grateful.
Thank you.
I will now turn the floor over to Dr. Susan Dvorak McMahon. Dr. McMahon is a clinical community psychologist, a Vincent DePaul professor in the psychology department, and associate dean for research and graduate programs in the College of Science and Health at DePaul University. She's author of more than 90 scholarly publications and past president and fellow of the Society for Community Research and Action, Division 27 of the American Psychological Association. Dr. McMahon is a respected scholar and academic leader, and she's the chair of the APA Task Force on Violence Against Educators and School Personnel. Dr. McMahon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Worrell, and thank you, Congresswoman Hayes, as well as Senator Padilla. I'm going to be presenting on our national findings from our task force study. Violence against educators and school personnel, crisis during COVID. Next slide, please. So first, I'd like to acknowledge our American Psychological Association Task Force on Violence Against Educators and School Personnel. We have a distinguished set of members who are expert researchers who have been working in this area for decades. And they include Dr. Eric Anderman from The Ohio State University, Dr. Ron Aviaster from UCLA, Dr. Dorothy Espelage from UNC Chapel Hill, Dr. Andrew Martinez from Center for Court Innovation, Dr. Linda Reddy from Rutgers University, and Dr. Frank Worrell from University of California, Berkeley. Next slide, please. This has been a very large effort with many collaborators, including APA has played a major support role, Rena Sabatnik, Maha Khalid, and Kenneth Polishchuk, as well as graduate students and postdoctoral fellows from all of our universities, as well as the school personnel who participated. Next slide. We also have 6 national partners, the NEA, AFT, NASP, NASW, SWA, and MCH Strategic Data. Next slide. I'd like to give you a little sense of our study overview. We conducted a national survey of school violence against adult stakeholders. This includes educators, school psychologists, school social workers, administrators, and school staff. We collected data from July 2020 to June 2021, and we included both quantitative and qualitative data during a global pandemic. Next slide. Our sample included 14,966 study participants with 9,370 teachers, 3,237 staff, 1,499 psychologists and social workers, and 860 school administrators. And you can see the breakdown was 81% female and 77% white. And these are roughly the gender and race ethnicity demographics of our educators and school personnel nationally. Next slide. So in terms of our quantitative results, we show that almost half, 49% of teachers expressed a desire or plan to quit their jobs or transfer to another school. The rates were also high across other stakeholders, with 29% in staff and 32% in administrators, and 34% of our school psychologists and social workers desired or planned to quit or transfer due to concerns about school safety and school climate. Next slide. Overall victimization, we had 54% of our participants overall reporting some type of violence or aggression during COVID. And when we look more specifically at what happened among the people in each role, we had 59% of teachers experience some type of violence or aggression, 38% of school psychologists and social workers, 48% of school staff, and 58% of school administrators. Next slide. Now to take a little bit closer look at verbal or threatening and violent victimization, and this includes obscene remarks, intimidation, verbal threats or attacks, bullying, cyberbullying, public humiliation, and sexual harassment. So these are not just, sort of difficult days. These are, significant verbal or threatening violence. And you can see the rates then. We have, sort of teachers, school psychologists, social workers, we had each kind of block. And then within that, we have the person who is doing the offending. So you have yellow is student aggressors. I'm sorry, blue is student aggressors, yellow is parents, sort of brown is colleagues, and green is administrators. So teachers, 1/3 of teachers experienced verbal or threatening victimization from students. And then, 29% of teachers reported this from parents. And then 14% of our teachers express this from colleagues. And then 18% of our teachers express this from administrative aggressors. So you can see across the board, this is not just a violence against teachers issue. This is happening across all of the adult stakeholders. And when you look at administrators, they're actually in the highest group, where they're reporting, 37% of our administrators are reporting verbal or threatening victimization from students, and 42% from parents, and 19% from colleagues. So it's a pretty significant issue, and this is all happening during COVID. Next slide. When we look at physical victimization, this was primarily happening by students. So the rates were very small across, looking at parent and colleagues and administrators. When we look at students more closely, we can see that the rates are between 14% and 22%, with teachers reporting physical victimization from students. And this includes objects thrown, weapon use, sexual assault, and physical attacks. And you can see the highest rate was for our school staff. And this is really the first comprehensive study to look across all stakeholders in a single study. And school psychologists and social workers and staff have really been underrepresented in the research. Next slide, please. We asked people to respond to this statement: I find my work stressful, and rate the extent to which that happened, from not at all to almost always. And what we found is that for teachers, it almost doubled from pre-COVID or before COVID to during COVID. So it went from, so during our assessment, 38% of teachers said they find their work stressful frequently or almost always. And it jumped to 72% during COVID. And you can see for each of the groups, So they all increased, and during COVID, the range went from 43% of our sample to 72%. And so these are especially difficult times during COVID. Next slide. We also gave them a range of training needs to sort of say, do you need additional support, mentoring, professional development in a variety of different strategies? And these are the top 5. And what we've done is we've averaged these across all of the school stakeholders. So you can see that over 50% of all the people who responded to our survey said, yes, I need more training in these areas. And they are social emotional learning approaches, trauma-informed practices, restorative justice practices, working with diverse groups, and de-escalation strategies. So there are a lot of training needs, and we're not preparing our educators and other school personnel well enough to address the issues that are going on in schools. Next slide, please. So we also asked a variety of open-ended questions in our survey where our participants wrote out their responses. And we went through thousands of responses, and we gathered and identified themes across each role, each stakeholder role, and then across stakeholders, and then looked at differences. And there are a few differences across roles, but there are actually a lot more similarities across roles. And we found, I'm going to talk about 6 major themes very briefly, and they were kind of across all roles. And then I have an example quotation from a participant. So aggression was the first theme. And within each theme, we have a variety of sub-themes. We just don't have time to talk about all of those today. But aggression was a primary theme. And here's an example quotation. I have been physically assaulted multiple times by students in the building, and they know that not only is there no one to stop them, but there will be no consequences either. I ended up in the hospital the last time it happened. Physical and mental well-being, this is another quotation. The ever increasing stress of this profession is taking the worst toll. I worry less about physical violence and much more about the trauma in my students' lives. The workload keeps increasing as we are expected to meet more and more student needs with less and less support and resources. Because the positives of this job no longer outweigh the negatives, I will not make it to my full pension. Next slide. Another primary theme was education and student support. And here's a quotation. The process to identify students for special education or behavioral supports must be streamlined. It currently takes an average of 8 months for a violent disruptive student to receive additional support services or be moved to a more appropriate setting. Policies was another primary theme. We need policies, procedures, and interventions to identify, address, and respond to student behaviors that lie outside the management capabilities of K-1 educators in the general education program. Students who regularly use violence, intimidation, or harassment to control or avoid despite interventions cannot be allowed to disrupt an entire classroom learning environment. Next slide. And the last 2 themes that I'm going to mention are resources. And here's an example. Because of the way educators have been treated throughout this pandemic, we are about to face a teacher shortage. If states don't provide some sort of incentive, we will not have enough teachers to run the schools in our country. This was already a problem, and now it is worse. And community and societal concerns, another significant theme. Given proper resources, we could gain insight from all of our communities to identify their needs and coordinate with community services and supports to mitigate those needs. Next slide. So we have a variety of recommendations, and I'm going to just express a few. Next slide. So we recommend research-based solutions, including the following: improve education preparation programs, support school personnel and student mental health and well-being, implement culturally relevant whole school initiatives, conduct assessments, improve school climate, and enhance school organizational functioning. And of course, we could talk for an hour about each one of those recommendations, but we're just giving a brief overview today. Next slide. The other thing we can do is support legislation. And we've categorized a variety of bills and programs into 4 main categories. And one is grow and diversify the workforce. The second is to create pathways to support mental and behavioral health needs of students and educators, to fund educator programs, educator training programs, and to fund school-based mental health programs. And I'll just call out the 2 that were mentioned by Congresswoman Hayes, the Save Education Jobs Act, and also Senator Padilla, who's supporting the Comprehensive Mental Health in Schools Pilot Program Act. Next slide. And our next portion of the program is going to involve speakers from the field. So we're going to have speakers from a variety of areas, including, we're going to start with Tonya Shonkwiler, and I'd like to introduce her first. So Tonya Shonkwiler is a special education teacher working with the Bozeman Public Schools in Bozeman, Montana. In her 17 years as an educator, she has had the opportunity to work with diverse student populations at the middle and high school levels and help students improve their social and communication skills. She is currently partnering with the Social Emotional Learning Alliance for the United States to bring a state branch to Montana to support local schools in providing high quality social and emotional learning programs. Thank you, Tonya, for being here.
Thank you. My name is Tonya Shonkwiler, and I'm a special education teacher for 18 years from Bozeman, Montana. And I'm a member of the Montana Federation of Public Employees. 2 years ago, I made a heartbreaking decision to leave my job. For 14 years, I worked with the most amazing students to build a program that supported their unique needs and challenges so that they could reach their potential and thrive outside of the classroom. For 14 years, I worked long hours, pouring my heart, tears, money, and sometimes blood for my students. For 14 years, I gave everything I had, and I had to make a difficult decision. I moved jobs. I moved to the general education classroom where now I support students with learning disabilities in a different capacity. Why did I leave? There are many stories, but this is one that I think about often. The student was 15, already bigger and stronger than me, and we were having a particularly hard day. We were in a room learning together, and as he struggled to self-regulate, I was punched in the face. My nose cracked, and it started to bleed. I struggled to follow our plan, struggled to support the student, and my face and clothing were covered in blood. An administrator was walking down the hallway and asked me if everything was okay. I said yes. Obviously, I wasn't. And the administrator walked away. I don't believe the administrator walked away because they didn't care. I believe they walked away because they didn't know how to support. They didn't have the resources to support us, and they didn't feel safe. I'm telling you this story because I want to make it clear that I didn't quit my job because of the overwhelming obstacles or even the aggression from my students, because all students come to us with different burdens. And no matter how bad these burdens, our kiddos cannot be cast aside. It's our job as educators to meet them where they're at and work our hardest to give them the safe and supportive learning environment that they deserve. I left because elected officials failed to give us the funding, and administrators didn't have the resources my students and my team needed to keep us safe. Now with COVID, everything has gotten worse. Violence is on the rise, and us educators and the students we work so hard to support are left high and dry. The under-resourcing of our nation's public schools is a real crisis. And to separate the chronic defunding of our schools from the violence it causes does a disservice to our students, our educators, and the conversations we're here to have today. I never thought I'd quit my dream job. Ever since high school, I knew this is what I was going to do. And that's what I did after college. I got a job working in middle school life skills program part-time and in a classroom supporting our students with social, emotional, and behavioral needs. A few years in, I was asked to lead and expand our life skills program at the high school level. This was my calling. And for the next 14 years, I taught the most amazing students, and I had my dream job. One of the things I love about special education is that we're bound to ensure each of our students is given a free and appropriate education in their least restrictive environment. This looks so different for each student. And for our students who are aggressive, this can be challenging, but it's doable. I've seen it. And when we invest in these students' education, we see growth, we see progress, and this allows them to be more independent as they leave the school system and require less supports as an adult. This is how society is supposed to work. But this requires support and resources within our schools. Real money for additional classrooms, teachers, paraeducators, social workers, counselors, and all the tools and training those staff need to be the best educators possible. We need those staff and tools because teachers' jobs have shifted. We are no longer just teachers. We are the social workers. We are the nurses. We are the counselors. The bottom line is that we always are asked to do a lot more than just teach. It's never been a reasonable or acceptable demand, but teachers are here because we want to see our students grow. We want to see them succeed. So we do it all, but it's become too much. We need to take things off teachers' plates. We need to support from our administrator to hire those critical staff that we need. What can we do? We can be proactive. We need mental health supports in our schools so teachers can teach and students can learn. We need more community resources to help support our students outside the classroom hours, to help them generalize their social, emotional, behavioral, and communication skills in all areas of their lives. We need to provide the appropriate support for our most challenging students. And to do all this, we need funding. We need to support our students with the most vulnerable needs, those who are developing their skills, those who are coming to us from trauma, and those who need a little bit more support to be successful members of their school. 2 years ago, when I made that hard decision, it was difficult. But I'm here today to let you know that I did not leave that role because it was hard. I did not leave that role because I didn't love it anymore. I left that role because year after year, I saw more resources being eliminated. It's a sad story every educator in this country knows. We're being told to do a whole lot more with a whole lot less. I've been hit, kicked, punched, and bit. I've gone home bruised and battered. But nothing caused me more harm than the lack of support and resources we needed to provide a learning environment where students and staff were safe. I hope to going back to working with students who need the most support. I'm hopeful teachers will be given the resources and support to provide a thriving learning environment that is safe for us, our staff, and our students. And I'm hopeful that everyone here listening today will truly understand how much of a crisis we're facing, especially during the age of COVID. I don't have blood pouring down my face anymore, and I'm not standing in the high school hallway. But today I'm speaking up to those who can make a difference. I'm asking all the people here for what I know we desperately need. Our schools and educators need your help. We need your support. We need you to advocate on our behalf and give voice to all the children across the nation who deserve their birthright. A public education that is fully funded to support and foster their curiosity, fullest potential, and contributions to society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tonya. Our next speaker is Tracy Cooper, who is a 22-year veteran school bus operator in Orange County, Florida, where she not only drives students each day on her own route, but serves as a team lead, working with managers and dispatchers to plan and cover other routes, mentor new bus drivers, and coordinate buses as they arrive. Tracy uses innovative and creative techniques and relationship building to ensure students on her bus follow the rules and have a safe and positive ride to school. Thank you, Tracy, for joining us today.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you for having me here. My name is Tracy Cooper. I'm from Orlando, Florida. I'm a bus operator for Orange County School Board. I'd like to thank the American Psychological Association for hosting this briefing on workplace violence in our schools. I also like to thank my local unions, the AFT and the NEA, for inviting me to participate today. Unfortunately, I have experienced and witnessed violence on the job. In my case, violence on the school bus. First of all, I'd like to mention that I do enjoy my job a lot. I also go out of my way to support my students and teammates. I'm especially proud of the ways in which I've tried to encourage positive student behavior on the bus. For example, occasionally I give out good bus riding certificates like this one. And I give the kids treats that I pay for out of my own pocket. Most of my riders are good and well behaved, but a few of them can make the ride dangerous for everybody, especially on open routes where there isn't an assigned bus driver due to behavior, and I have to combo that route with my route. What I want you to know is what violence on the bus look like and ways we can stop it. First off, school bus operators and monitors need appropriate training. We need tools, tactics, and support in helping to prevent and de-escalate situations that can turn violent. It takes time and money to train the people who are transporting our students. Our working conditions continue to deteriorate and get more dangerous as the school bus turnover rate increases. Low pay, long hours, and the threat of violence make it so you have fewer and fewer experienced drivers sticking around. They can get the same or better pay in a safer job almost anywhere. So let me tell you a little more about my job right now. I've been here 22 years. I start each day around 6 a.m. And on most days, I take a morning break around 10:30. I start again around 1:30 and finish in the evening anywhere from 6 to 9. I have a long route, plus I have to combo other routes because we don't have enough bus drivers. You may already know that violence on school buses and in the classroom have increased since the pandemic has begun. It comes especially dealing with few emotionally disturbed kids, and it's made worse by parents who step on the bus and threaten the bus driver and other students, which reinforces the kids' negative behavior. Let me give you a few examples. One of my coworkers who was fairly new in the position, she had just started, she learned her job and her new route, but she was attacked by a special needs student and she immediately quit. She was bitten badly, which was triggered by a fire truck going by. Usually there's a monitor on the bus, but on this day, there was a substitute bus monitor who didn't know what to do, and she just stood there. Lack of training, and it wasn't her regular route. Luckily for me, I've only had one student attempt to physically attack me. He came on the bus that day and he had this look on his face that meant trouble. I slowly went to the back of the bus and warned the bus monitor that the student seemed like he was going to act up and for her to get ready. As I walked back to the front of the bus, this behavior student tried to push me down, but I was prepared for it and was able to react appropriately until the school resource officer arrived to the bus. Usually my biggest complaints are mostly with parents, negative behavior from parents, and parents coming to the buses making threats. Just recently, a few months ago, a parent threatened to have me fired because I was simply carrying out safety measures, the mask policy required by the school district. Just because parents disagree with the school substance policy, it doesn't give them the license to make threats or block the buses from moving. And that's what that parent did on that day. Kids usually model the behavior on what they see the adults do, with examples like this. Our middle and high school students are threatening and attacking bus drivers and monitors, as well as teachers and school staff, and not much is getting done about this, and the students know this. I want to emphasize that the workplace violence is intensified when we don't have enough experienced staff who are properly trained. It takes away, it takes a while to train people and for them to learn the ropes and to get comfortable. So for me, what might be what might be affected that help resolve the tension and other problems? First and foremost, respect. A lack of respect. Respect, better wages, and quarterly training programs for the drivers and monitors. When I first started, there was training classes the week before school started about positive ways to correct students with behavior issues, positive reinforcement, how to protect yourself, and other good practice. But this training didn't happen last year, and I don't recall the last time it did happen. The training material we have received recently doesn't make sense for transportation, and the examples are poor and doesn't address aggressive parents. Let me say it again. I love and enjoy being around young people, interacting with them, students on my route, and talking with them about what's going on in the world. I like being out in the field and getting to visit new places on field trips. I want to keep my bus safe and orderly, but out of control behavior risks accidents and deaths, and I can't fix it alone. I have my state and local units to help me speak up. I believe that with higher pay and better training to deal with the new realities we're facing, we can correct this dangerous situation on our school buses. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Tracy.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're going to move on to our next speaker, Dr. Byron McClure, who is a national certified school psychologist and founder of Lessons for SEL, where he uses research, human-centered design thinking to build empathy, ideate, co-create solutions, and design equitable resources that put the needs of children front and center. He formerly served as the assistant director of school redesign at a high school in Southeast DC, where he was responsible for leading and reimagining what social emotional learning looked like within an inner city community.
Thank you for that introduction. Thank you to the American Psychological Association for having me and for doing this important work. I had something written down. I had so much that I wanted to say. Listening to the other panelists, it's moving. And if you're not moved by these stories that's being shared, I don't know what else to tell you. My work is unique. I am a school psychologist. Interestingly enough, I have been the first African-American school psychologist in the first district where I worked. Then I went on to work in Washington, D.C. in a high school located in Ward 8, which has one of the highest rates of poverty in the district. We are in a very unique position as a country, as a nation, and now is the opportunity to do something powerful. Now is the opportunity that we have to authentically move the needle forward. Our teachers need it. Our school leaders need it. Our parents need it. The community needs it. Importantly, our young people who are our future need it. One of the things that I have recognized in our work, we don't have to make this complex. We have gone on for so long not meeting the needs of people. Somewhere along the way, we have lost the humanity in the work that we have done. The past 2 years, I've been fortunate to redesign a high school in DC, and we use the approach that's called human-centered design. And it's a simple premise that we put the needs of people first. And now I'm speaking from my heart because it's hard work, but it has to be hard work that we're doing. And one of the ways that we go about that is understanding the needs of people. We're talking about violence and aggression and all these harsh words, but what's happening, whether it's students, whether our staff, there's something that's not being met. In our approach, we had to look at the systems, the conditions, the structures, the lack of policies or initiatives that have failed people, whether you're student, staff, or whatever. In our work, we looked at how can we redesign those systems and structures to create favorable outcomes for everyone involved. And a big component of that work, y'all, has started with listening to the needs of people. And when we hear the needs from our students, when we hear the needs of parents, our school leaders, our psychologists, our social workers, we can understand on an authentic level what we need to do. The solutions are there. Teachers have been shouting for so long. We need accountability. We need support. Everyone that you've heard before me has poured out what it is that they need. We know what we need to do. We need to do it. We have to put people first. As a school psychologist, in my perspective, there are several things that we know we can do right away. One of the things that we can do is understanding the needs of educators and doing everything to elevate their voices, to bring them into the decision-making process so that we can take into consideration based on teachers being on the front lines and doing something about it, equipping our staff with the skills that they need to understand social emotional development, to equip our young people as well with the skills that they need in a preventative manner and not responding when it's too late, y'all. That means starting at pre-K, starting at elementary school, teaching explicit social skills, social emotional development, conflict resolution, things that we know work, you all. We also have to be in the business of amplifying the voices of all of our key stakeholders, constantly engaging, creating space where we can have multiple communication and touch points so that we can actually take action on the things that we know work. We must prioritize comprehensive mental and behavioral health for our students and for our staff. How can we expect our staff to come into places that their needs aren't being met? So whether it's through training, one of the things we did at Anacostia High School, we had meetings where we listened to the needs of staff. And then we took action by having staff wellness. We created this event called A Time to Heal, where we paused everything that we were doing. We created solutions. We brought in clinical psychologists. We brought in wellness activities. We brought in mindfulness activities. We brought in sound baths. We brought in movement. We brought in physical instructors to meet the needs of our staff, because we were dealing with gun violence. We were dealing with student deaths, y'all. We're losing our young people. And our staff experience vicarious trauma as well. And so if we can do these things to meet the needs of staff, then when we have staff who aren't just getting their basic needs met, they are moving from just being okay in wellness to a place of thriving. So now more than ever, we are in a amazing point where we can bring thriving into the conversation, where we can create transformative change for our young people, where we bring joy back into schools, where they're excited about learning, where they're excited to build relationships, to experiment, to take chances, to take risks, to fail in a safe space so that they can learn and then make a difference. And then they grow up, they get jobs, and they come back into the community and they make a difference, y'all. We are at a pivotal time. And shout out to APA, y'all, because we can do it. And the last thing I'll say, I know I'm close to my time. The last thing that I want to say, we must fund school psychologists. The NASS recommended ratio is 1 psychologist to 500 students. I'm going on record and saying that we have to have a school psychologist. Let's go ahead and say school social workers in every school, so that we can alleviate the burdens of our staff. We can support students. We can support staff, administrators, school leaders, and parents as well. So join me in this fight to bring a school psychologist to every school across the nation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. McClure. We have such excellent speakers, and I just want to say their experiences are representative of many, many educators and school personnel. So we have one more speaker, and after our last speaker, then we're going to be opening up for a Q&A. So we're honored to have Dr. Debra Duardo, who's been the Los Angeles County Superintendent of Schools since 2016, where she oversees 80 K-12 school districts that serve 1.4 million students. She is also currently the president-elect of the California County Superintendents Educational Services Association. Her training as a social worker gives her a unique perspective into the needs of students, families, and educators. So thank you for being here, Dr. Duardo.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with all of you. You know, schools have been the center of support for students and families during this pandemic. When in-person learning was no longer safe because of COVID, schools provided computers, internet access so that students could continue learning remotely, and so that families could have access to critical resources such as healthcare, access to COVID test kits, and vaccinations. They also provided meals, groceries, hygiene products, baby formula, diapers, and other basic needs. And they did wellness checks to make sure their students were safe and cared for. Unfortunately, schools are now becoming catch-all centers for individuals with misplaced frustrations. We're witnessing widespread political polarization inside schools, creating tremendous disruption and interfering with our schools and districts' ability to educate students. Whether it's the COVID-19 mitigation efforts, such as vaccines and masking, social justice, the role of law enforcement, or social emotional learning and mental health. We've had multiple situations where school board members, superintendents, school administrators, and teachers have been shouted at, spit at, even threatened by parents angry over school policies. Superintendents are reporting an increase in violent behaviors unlike anything they've ever experienced. Students exhibiting more disruptive and aggressive behaviors, increases with students physically attacking other students and staff, an increase in sexual harassment and sexual assaults, even an increase in weapons on campus, and not just at the secondary level. One superintendent shared her challenge with parents sending elementary school students to school and directing them to walk in with masks and remove them once they were in the classroom as an act of defiance, telling children to ignore their teachers' directions to put on their masks, Principals, educators, and school staff are being threatened. They're being threatened by parents when they attempt to enforce the health orders. Board meetings have had to be closed after a protester approached the dais, positioned herself in front of the board, and persisted in screaming, "No more masks." Individuals, including parents and their children, joining board meetings, urging inappropriate language and threatening board members. Many superintendents have received death threats, not just towards themselves, but to their family members when they implemented vaccination and masking mandates. People showed up to their homes to protest. Some superintendents indicated that when they reached out to law enforcement for help, they were told to file a restraining order. Have we gotten to the point where filing restraining orders on our parents in our own school districts is even an option or necessary? Prior to becoming the LA superintendent of schools, I served as a school social worker, and I understand how trauma, isolation, and grief can impact behavior and acts of violence. Stress levels are high for everyone. However, loud, sometimes violent fights over whether masks should be mandatory or how to teach about race in schools is unacceptable. To address these concerns, we need to have civilized conversations based on facts that are culturally relevant and student-focused. We need more mental health support for our students and our adults. We need to support parents and encourage them to talk to their children about using resources that are available at school when they need help. But they also need to talk to their children on the consequences of inappropriate behavior and breaking school rules. We need all adults to serve as role models and model what good behavior looks like, not engage in disruptive behavior themselves. We need to provide our educators with more professional development on trauma and its impact on children. And finally, we need to do everything possible to take care of our school employees and ensure their right to a safe, hostile-free work environment where teachers can continue to teach and where children can learn and thrive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Duardo. We really appreciate all four of our speakers, and I think it's definitely been a very powerful experience in terms of both seeing some of the data collectively, as well as hearing individually from people who are on the front lines. So thank you so much. I think we're now moving into the Q&A portion.
Okay, so I can begin to pose the first question while we're having panelists spotlighted. So this comes from a former teacher who themselves have experienced aggressive behaviors from parents and students. They say, "I'm a strong advocate of the de-escalation, trauma-informed strategies, and restorative justice. Sometimes the active aggression I endured warranted discipline, but my administrators did not follow up, or the student would end up back in the classroom. Sometimes it's difficult for teachers to see the long-term results of school climate initiatives when every day is a risk to our physical and mental well-being. Where is the line?" Would someone like to take that question? Dr. Anderman?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's difficult to know where the line is, but I think what this resonates with is a lot of what we found in our data, in that one of the greatest things that educators requested was greater involvement in decision-making and feeling powerless. And I think that a first step in helping that would be greater involvement of educators in making decisions, and what Dr. McClure said, listening to what they need and then involving them in that decision-making process. That was so strong in the voices of our participants.
Thank you. Anyone else? Great.
Yeah, I could take that as well too. I think underlying some of the questions that I've seen over here, I just want to throw away a big takeaway that we may have gotten lost, but was in McClure's, Dr. McClure's and Debra Duardo's answer and some of the other statements, is that the difference between this study and a lot of other studies and what we've heard from our participants is that it's affecting everybody. It's not just teachers, it's social workers, it's psychologists. And a lot of the issues are about evidence-based programs, but many of them are about capacity, about do we have enough social workers? Do we have enough psychologists? Do we have enough funding to have smaller classrooms with teachers who could really do this and supports? So some of it is organizational and some of it is capacity oriented. And that part is missing a little bit from the recent laws and the funding. And we hope that this work will further the systemic work. So it addresses like 5 or 6 of the questions that are in there. And that's what's a little bit different from our work, is they're all kind of telling the same story, is it's not just training and teaching, they just are underfunded, understaffed, and do not have enough help organizationally to create a positive, healthy environment. We have lots of great examples we could learn from, but we need more funding and supports and guidance to do that.
Great, thank you so much. So this next question is directly for Dr. McClure. How were these comprehensive programs at Anacostia funded and staffed? Any more specific information would be helpful.
Absolutely. Our school, we went through what's called a redesign process. Our school, we were last across every statistical category. And instead of closing our school down, the district, the mayor of DC made the determination to redesign our school to transform it. As a result of that, the district put funding towards it. We did receive some federal grants to go towards it. One of the questions is, how can we continue sustaining that work past those grants? But we did receive support direct from the district. We did receive federal funding to support that work as well. But the important thing that was just mentioned is, how can we sustain that work, right? So it just doesn't have to be based off of additional funding that'll run out in 2 years. Like, we need these supports and resources so that this can be the way of school. And I'm happy to provide more detailed information about that redesign process.
Thank you. Yes, that's really helpful. So the next question is, what would be a suggested intervention for violent or aggressive student behavior? Are there evidence-based strategies to intervene before and during aggressive and violent actions that do not involve police in schools? Have there been discussions about trauma-informed practices and staff being put into the school as additional supports? What steps can we take to increase mental health, trauma-informed, and social skill funding? Who would like to take that question?
I'll take it. This has just been wonderful, and I am moved. So I appreciate this conversation. I think this question, one, we do have really strong evidence-based programs to improve school climate and school safety. The issue is implementing them with fidelity, with an eye towards sustainability, right? And that requires resources and funding and commitment, and a voice from all of the school members, including parents and including community members. A lot of folks have talked about this idea that researchers are dismissed. Of course, we have been in that space, and this is why we have been working for the last 2.5 years under the leadership of Dr. McMahon to really bring this to the front, that we do have evidence-based programs. However, we also do know in our schools that we continue to implement programs that are not effective and are actually harmful to some of our brown and Black kids. And so I think we can do social emotional learning, but it has to be transformative, it has to be equity-based, and it has to be sustainable. And also, it's not just SEL and trauma informed for our students, but it's also for the families and the teachers that are continually experiencing trauma every day as they go to school.
Yeah, thanks, Dorothy. I agree with everything you say. And I would add that we need to remember that schools exist in the context of a society, right? Our students see on television, they see on the news how people are responding to problems. So if we want, in fact, to change how students respond in schools, we also need to think about our larger societal context and how people, including members of our legislatures and so forth, parents are responding at the school board meetings, and because all of those observational learning is a very, very powerful tool. So we need to think more holistically about our interventions. Thanks.
Dr. Martinez, do you have your hand up?
Yes, thank you, everyone. Just want to add that in our survey, when we asked teachers, well, what should we do about this? What works? For the most part, in this survey, teachers and other school staff, what they're saying is, they're focusing on strategies. They mentioned strategies that are sort of relationship based. They're saying things such as like restorative justice, trauma-informed practices. So I think that's very noteworthy, but also what they're not saying is teachers were, what was least mentioned by teachers as a way to intervene is things such as zero tolerance policies. So they're not saying, let's suspend all students. In this survey, teachers were not saying that. And we have lots of evidence and research that supports the fact that these zero tolerance policies are not effective. So just again, to reiterate, what are teachers saying is the solution? It's about school climate. It's about building relationships.
Duardo?
Thank you. I just wanted to add, there is a historic amount of dollars being invested in education, but it's short-term dollars. And it's going to take a lot more than short-term dollars to allow us to recover from this pandemic. And as someone just mentioned previously, how critical it is that we have established partnerships and relationships. So relationships with the community, the nonprofit organizations that can help support our schools, but also all of our county departments, such as Department of Mental Health and Public Health and Department of Children and Family Services, and truly anybody who's serving children and families, coming together and leveraging resources and braiding both public and private dollars to make sure that we can implement these effective programs. There are many evidence-based programs that we know work with children in communities of color that are supportive of teachers and community. However, we need to have those partnerships. We need to have funding that is sustainable and not something simply to get us through this pandemic when we know these issues existed long before the pandemic, although they've been exacerbated by this pandemic and the grief and isolation that everyone has experienced. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Reddy?
Yes, thank you. This has been absolutely wonderful. I just wanted to make a few comments about strategies that are being used to manage and to promote student behavior. Was highlighted for sure in our survey, but one piece that I think is really important is school personnel's need for wellness strategies and strategies to support their mental health needs and feelings of safety going to school, being at school, and leaving the campuses of school as well. We need sustained new system practices to support all educators and school personnel now. As mentioned, our data highlights that everyone is feeling a sense of harm being at school and a sense of tremendous dedication to be there to help America's students. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to work with folks, our national organizations, on figuring out better organizational and system level improvements for schools that are very pointed to the adults, including parents that surround school as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. McClure, and then we'll wrap it up after that.
Yeah, and I know we have other questions, so I'll just be very brief. One of the things that we also must do is bring in students to be part of the solution. It's easy for us as adults, as researchers, as clinicians to come up with all of the solutions, but we must co-create solutions. Students must be part of the solution. They know the context, they know their environment, community members knows the context, their environment as well. So we must co-create, co-design solutions together. And then when you can do that, students will be more empowered, staff will be more empowered, and those solutions will be more meaningful because it fits within the context of that school environment. And so my dissertation looked at evidence-based curriculums from Castle. So often those curriculums fail because they weren't designed for your demographic. And so by co-creating, co-designing bringing people into the conversation, you can create solutions that meets the needs of people directly. So that's something that's also super important that we can't forget as well.
Thank you. Dr. McMahon?
And sometimes the best solutions are free.
I love that, Dr. McClure. So I think, you're sort of hearing a lot of consistency across the messages. And I just want to add, so sort of taking into account community context, community and school context for holistic, comprehensive, ecologically based solutions, we need to have coordinated approaches and not just sort of we'll throw some funding here or there. It's like if we need to sort of be very planful and comprehensive in our approaches. And I would also just say this task force work, we've been working on this for a long time. We are continuing to work on this, and we are getting ready to do the next round of our survey, and it'll be posted on APA's website when it's ready, hopefully next week. But we're going to do another, so we're going to be able to compare across time what's happening now in schools across all these stakeholders. What are their concerns? What's improved? What are their recommendations? So we invite people who are in those roles in pre-K through 12th grade to take part in that.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We're over time, actually. We've had a lot of questions, but I think that most of the questions in some way were answered with all the comments that our speakers have made today. So thank you again so very much to everyone that joined us today. The recording will be available, and as well as any of the corresponding documents, and will be shared with everyone who registered. And thank you so much again. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you,
everyone.